into the pulpit with a little more fear and trembling than usual. I usually am concerned about what might come out of my mouth and how it will be received, how it will be echoed back to me for months and years. But this week I'm a little more conscious of the visual image that I present. The last time I preached here, a picture was taken. And I was shocked when I saw it, because I can't imagine what I might have been saying at the time. In the picture, my hand is thrown back like this, and you can see all 24 of my teeth. I've had occasion to see this picture on almost a weekly basis ever since. In each church email newsletter, Brenda will be teaching Sunday school. Brenda will be leading an adult forum. And this week, Brenda will be preaching. I fear that if I were to see a picture like this next to a church event in a newsletter, I would avoid that event like the plague. Because here's the thing. The photo looks kind of like one of those hellfire and damnation preachers in full apoplectic stride. The finger point alone indicates some righteous judgment, and the arm and the teeth suggest the kind of religion that beats congregations into submission through harsh speech. Kind of like the leader of the synagogue in the story from Luke that Joe shared with us today. Bless his heart. The synagogue leader, well, and Joe's. But that synagogue leader, he was only trying to keep a little decorum and order. Something hard to do when Jesus shows up. I mean, we've seen it in other stories about Jesus. He heals one person, and pretty soon everybody within 10 miles who has anything from a hangnail to an advanced case of leprosy is crowded in the room trying to get their share of the wholeness that Jesus brings. And chaos does tend to ensue. We've read that sometimes even people start taking the very building apart where Jesus is to try to get to him for that healing. And on this day, in this story, Jesus heals the bent-over woman. And the synagogue leader looks around and sees growing excitement in the eyes of everyone gathered there. And he decides he's going to nip that disorder in the bud. So he reminds them of the law they all have in common. And he tells them there are 6 days for work in our Jewish tradition. Come and be healed on those days, not on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath. Law and order, baby. Law and order. It's easy to read this story and really a whole bunch of stories and think that Jesus is an outlaw, that he's breaking the rules and totally disregarding the tradition. Sabbath schmabbath. We don't need no stinking Sabbath. In recent years, Jesus has gotten even more of this reputation, particularly in Southern Protestant Christianity. I was thinking the other day about planning for Easter dinner. My dad lives down the block from me, so we'll be inviting him for Easter dinner. And my dad, like many other Southern Americans, likes a nice spiral-cut ham for Easter. In the South, you would think that Easter was not about the resurrection of Jesus, but the fact that he freed us from those pesky kosher laws, and that we can now eat ham. And so Easter becomes the great celebration of we can eat ham. Am I right? Amen. But Jesus isn't arguing against Judaism. It's his faith, and he upholds it very seriously. He's in the synagogue every week. He observes the Sabbath, mostly. He keeps kosher, mostly. And it's the faith and the tradition that he lives. He believes that there's no work on the Sabbath, except he knows there's exceptions. And he points some of those exceptions out. Don't each of you here untie your ox or your donkey from their place in the stall to lead them out to give them water on the Sabbath. Technically that's work. We don't light a fire on this day, we don't lift a finger on this day, but yeah, we you water the donkey? Jesus references a deep tradition within the tradition, one that everyone gathered would know very deeply themselves. It's a tradition related to compassion for the livestock. And there's a lot of biblical law and Jewish tradition around this respect and care for these animals that can't care for themselves. For example, biblical law states that animals, like people, are given a day off on the Sabbath. So it's not just people, but our oxes and our donkeys and all our animals that labor with us also get a day to rest. Animals, unlike people, are given food on fast days. So animals are not required to fast just because people feel like it's a good day to fast. And Jewish tradition based on Scripture states that people should feed their livestock before they sit down to eat themselves. There are segments of Judaism that take this tradition very, very, very seriously. In fact, I was reading about a group who believed that once you say the blessing, you should not do anything else. You should just eat right after the blessing. And they were saying that, the exception is if you say the blessing and you realize no one's fed the animals, you can stop and send someone to feed the animals before we eat. So it's an important tradition. And we know from this story that even though they wouldn't light a candle, even though they wouldn't do the least little bit of work for fear that somebody might see them and think it was work, not one of them would hesitate to go untie their ox or their donkey and make sure that they don't thirst. Compassion for the thirsty donkey is as much a part of Jewish law and tradition as observance of the Sabbath. You untie that donkey and take it from its stall to get water, regardless of the day of the week. And so, Jesus concludes, shouldn't we give this same care to this daughter of Abraham and Sarah, who has been tied to her stall of illness for 18 years? Why should she have to wait another day for her thirst for wholeness to be quenched? When he calls her a daughter of Abraham, what he's saying is that she is a member of their community. And in fact, if you trace back the family tree enough, she's a member of their family. And isn't she more important than a thirsty donkey? Shouldn't we give people at least the same compassion, the same basic care that we would give an ass? I know I just said that word. That's why people like it when I preach, because I use words like that. We still struggle with law today. For Jesus, I think law centered around identity and about relationship with God and one another, and keeping the kind of boundaries that help us to have that right relationship with God, one another, and ourselves. And we still struggle today with our legislative process. Think more about that as the week goes on. About our government, about our rules and our religion, and all the things that seem like they're more aimed at control than compassion. And it's a pickle. Sometimes we'd like to just ditch the whole business. And sometimes, particularly with religion, people do. Because it's easier to just ditch the whole thing than to try to sort out the difference between control and compassion, particularly when compassion seems so difficult to find. My working title, before I started cruising the, what's the TV show? Big Bang Theory episode was, my working title for the sermon was something about the baby in the bathwater. That's as far as I got with that. Because as I've studied the text, I've come to believe that it's an encouragement not to religious libertarianism or religious anarchy, but a challenge for us to work on our interpretation and meaning. I don't think that we're to throw the baby of law and tradition out with the bathwater of our judgmental, cultural control issues. We're to study the biblical law, but always in the context of the thirsty donkey juxtaposition. What do our Jewish roots offer each of us in terms of life and grace in the midst of these ancient laws and rituals? How do they make us more compassionate, more able to bring healing and to quench thirst? How does law and tradition make us closer to one another and to God? Jesus doesn't tell them just to go willy-nilly and break the law. Instead, he brings another portion of the law that leads them to a deeper and more compassionate interpretation. It's funny how studying these texts can lead you places you don't expect to go. Even the simple act of studying these laws of compassion for animals has caused a shift in me this week. This is kind of a side trail, but I thought I'd share it with you. One of my Facebook friends helpfully posted a picture of a pig in a factory farming situation. Just as I was studying these laws with shrimp this year. Maybe some catfish. Something that isn't factory farmed like a pig. I didn't expect that to come out of sermon preparation. Another thing that I've pondered this week has been this tradition of Sabbath itself. As I kept asking myself, what ties us to our proverbial stalls? From what do we need to be freed? What keeps us bent over and oppressed? I kept expecting it to go kind of political directions or social directions, and where I kept coming back was the idea of Sabbath, something we have pretty much totally abandoned and rejected as religious expression. Most of us don't keep an hour of Sabbath during the week. Most of us feel pretty guilty if we're not in constant motion. The idea of a whole day of rest and renewal is frankly alien. So many of us are in constant motion, working, cleaning, caring for our family, paying bills, volunteering, doing this, that, the other, always moving. And we feel incredibly guilty if we slow down or stop. Tuesday was scheduled to be my day off during the week from work. And since it was my scheduled day off, my plan was to go into work at 8 for one meeting, and then to stay for a second meeting at 10, since it was my day off and all. And then in the afternoon to take my dad to appointments and run on errands. And I got up Tuesday morning, and I looked out the window, and it was raining, and I could hear it crunching as it hit. It was that icy rain Tuesday morning. And I thought, what am I doing? And I just happened to get up in preparation for preaching, and I thought, what am I doing? Why am I preaching on Sabbath and going to work? And so I didn't. Because it was my day off. Sometimes we are the bent over woman, and sometimes we are the ass.